1998 was the year I first learnt about Mantle. It happened in a dusty conference room hidden away in the Pentagon's basement. A few other intelligence types and I were getting a briefing from some NSA analyst on cyber warfare, a relatively new field at the time. Between presentations on the Cubans and the Chinese, the analyst brought up an innocent enough-looking PowerPoint slide. It was 2 words in 24-point Arial on a white background: CRUEL MANTLE. He explained the term was a code phrase for a bit of malware that had been making the rounds on Russian government servers. It was a relatively minor breach, but of unknown origin. Possibly engineered by political dissidents, the analyst had said. He used it to illustrate some broader point about non-state actors, then moved on to more important things. For a while, so did I. The next time I heard the words CRUEL MANTLE was in 2000. At the time, we were focused on the newest dirty war in the Caucasus, an opportunity to learn about Russian battle tactics. I got attached to an Air Force unit out of Colorado, with orders to watch the conflict from orbit using their fleet of reconnaissance satellites. Military brass can be protective of their toys, so it took some time to get things moving. When the right general signed the right paperwork and the satellites shifted into an orbit over Chechnya, they were surprised by what they saw, or I guess, didn't see. I got the news at 4 a.m. from some wide-eyed lieutenant, practically trying to break down my hotel room door. "Empty skies," he'd said. A taxi ride and a cup of coffee later, I was in a comms center poring over satellite imagery. Empty skies indeed. The fleet of Soviet-era Cosmos spy satellites we knew we'd find over Chechnya wasn't there, but their telemetry was. Total nonsense data was flowing in and out of Russian military command and onto the battlefield. Tank columns were being driven in circles. Non-existent cities were being shelled. Whole battalions were being ordered to fire at one another. And it wasn't just Cosmos that had been compromised. Every word of Russian military chatter that touched a computer was being twisted into pure disinformation. The war in Chechnya had been over for weeks, and no one knew. Not the Russians, not the separatists, not the news. A whole region of the world had been turned into an information black hole, where up was down and left was right, and no one had figured it out. When the dust finally settled and everyone went home, in a body bag or otherwise, only we knew about the war that wasn't. The Chechen phony war hung over US intelligence like a black cloud. We were jumping at shadows and asking questions with no answers. Where did the garbage data come from? How do you so thoroughly compromise a military that you get them chasing their own tail? Could it happen to us? If it did, would we even know? We got a partial answer a month or so later when a CIA direct action unit on the Russia-Ukraine border got their hands on an FSB server that thought it was talking to a Cosmos satellite that we knew wasn't there. It was smuggled out of the region and eventually made its way into an NSA clean room, where it was brought under both a literal and metaphorical microscope. It took another month for a digital forensics team to find what we knew had to be there. They caught the worm deep in the machine's heart with its tendrils over every nanometer of silicon. That was how I ended up, once again, in a Pentagon conference room looking at the words CRUEL MANTLE on a PowerPoint slide. It was clear now that we had underestimated Mantle, an NSA contractor explained to us. The greatest minds Booz Allen Hamilton could hire had concluded Mantle was the most sophisticated malware they'd ever encountered. It could compromise nearly any commercially available computer using an arsenal of undiscovered exploits and spoofed hardware certificates. On top of that, it was only one part of a whole. The NSA team had reason to believe Mantle was designed to be part of some vast distributed algorithm, its function unknown. At the end of that presentation, we only knew one thing for sure. CRUEL MANTLE was, by far, the gravest national security threat to the United States. A few months later, September 11th rolled around, and the intelligence community was given a blank check and carte blanche to protect the United States. With that mandate, we started the hunt for CRUEL MANTLE. The first problem was finding it. Mantle was virtually undetectable once it had burrowed its way into a machine, so we decided to look for the shadow it cast. If we could find more information black holes like Chechnya, we could find Mantle. And so, work began on the mass surveillance programs that would eventually come to permeate even the darkest corners of the internet. I was assigned to work as a liaison to Five Eyes, the international signals intelligence network of the Anglosphere. As information started to flow through our data centers, we started to find discrepancies where what you saw looking inside out wasn't what you saw looking outside in. Dozens of information black holes existed across the globe, mostly in Africa and the Near East, where the flow of information was already stymied by patchy networks. All sorts of low-intensity conflicts and political unrest was being driven by garbage data coming out of infected networks. We watched armies shoot up villages sympathetic to non-existent insurgencies, and governments be toppled in protest of non-existent policies. No one was safe either. Mantle was indiscriminate in its creation of information black holes, holding no apparent political affiliation. In those early days, we made regular probing attacks on Mantle. I remember listening in on a British operation in West Africa at the tail end of some civil war. In the dead of night, a team of GCHQ officers broke into a switchboard spewing enough disinformation to fuel the phony war for decades. They patched every known vulnerability in the network overnight and were on a one-way flight back to Heathrow before sunrise. The next morning, a car bomb vaporized the switchboard. While I watched the charred bodies get pulled from the rubble live on BBC One, I knew it was only because Mantle was letting me. The message was clear. You push me, I push back. The more we learned, the more apparent it became that there was a twisted method to Mantle's madness. Meta-analysis of infected networks showed that the distributed algorithm running in the background of every Mantle instance was part of some broader machine intelligence. As a result, it could learn to pry open secure systems on its own and adapt to most of the countermeasures we threw its way. With the Five Eyes mass surveillance programs in full swing, our algorithms started to pick out signals in the noise of garbage data that came out of Mantle networks. It was disinformation, sure, but it wasn't random anymore. In Chechnya, the black hole put people in the dark. Now it was putting people in the dark and telling them to jump at the shadows. It wasn't long before it became accepted fact in Five Eyes circles that Mantle was, to some extent, self-aware. 2004 was the beginning of the end. A Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker found something on the Arctic pack ice while on patrol, the wreck of a U.S. Air Force Milstar satellite. Problem was, on our end, Milstar DFS-4 was still sending a steady stream of telemetry to every Air Force ground station across the U.S. We had to see it in person. It was the only way to be sure. I'll never forget looking out the window of a Sea-Knight helicopter and seeing $800 million of satellites scattered across the ice like a bug on a windshield. When we touched down, the Air Force team got to work. A year, they told me, after they'd picked through the wreckage. The satellite had dropped out of orbit at least a year ago. Standing there above the Arctic Circle in a parka I'd bought the day before, watching my breath condensate, I realized we were fighting a losing war. Just like the Russians all those years ago, we'd been blinded and didn't know it. Five Eyes was growing cataracts, and there was no way of knowing how bad it really was. If the U.S. Air Force had been compromised, we had to assume every machine on the Five Eyes network was riddled with Mantle. Our only choice was to retreat into secure, air-gapped facilities. I moved my family out to Utah and started working in an air-gapped NSA office off the Great Salt Lake. It was slow, stressful work. Jumping through all the security hoops to get past the air gap was so tedious, I took to sleeping at the office most nights. My marriage started to go down the tubes as a result, and things came to a head when my daughter tried to show me her MySpace page. Watching her surf across a dozen pages in a minute, I knew what vector Mantle would use to compromise the United States. For years, our physical control of the internet backbone and centralized information channels kept the worst of Mantle's garbage data at bay. But now, with Five Eyes blinded, and the private sector building a decentralized information highway into the minds of every American, we had a vulnerability with no patch. That night, I trashed every computer in the house and canceled our cable subscription. The next morning, my wife kicked me out. The next week, she filed for divorce. I had bigger things to worry about. The world had bigger things to worry about. Just as we'd predicted, when social media got its fangs into the developed world, so did Mantle. We tried to wage economic warfare on Silicon Valley to bankrupt them before they could push us past the event horizon of an information black hole, but the market forces were too strong. Social media would be the new battlefield. Before the inflection point of the medium's exponential growth, Mantle manifested itself in strange ways on the likes of MySpace and Friendster. Our crippled, but still vast mass surveillance programs started picking up on what we eventually came to call radio cults. Mantle was radicalizing users on the fringe of social media with garbage data that, after months of brain rot, gave them a pseudoscientific reverie for wireless technology, usually high-frequency radio. When a given group had festered for long enough on the web, Mantle set them loose in the wilderness where they lived like animals and built effigies to electromagnetism. At the time, this was a departure from Mantle's usual MO. This attack was more restrained, more focused, almost like it had something more than simple human suffering in mind. Whatever it was, we weren't keen on it. The 2007 financial crisis turned the states into a petri dish for the radio cults. In that year alone, federal law enforcement had, with our help, broken up over 300 of them. We dragged them out of the dark, burnt their effigies to the ground, and convicted them in secret intelligence courts. If we couldn't get a charge to stick, we'd sick a CIA paramilitary unit on them with orders to kill. I was attached to one of those units when they flushed a cult out of the Sonoran Desert, not an hour's drive outside of Phoenix. When the shooting stopped, my team and I went in to catalog everything we could, turning data into feedstock for our predictive models. The cultists that surrendered were proned out on the sand, cuffs across their wrists and hoods over their heads. The rest were being zipped up in body bags. At the center of their squalid camp was a 3-story tall monument of rocks, garbage, and human flesh. Like the rest of them, it could have been a radio tower if you squinted hard enough. I had one of my guys drag a cultist over and asked him what I asked them all. "What is it?" He answered in tongues, possessed by Mantle's disinformation. Garbage in, garbage out. The radio cult started to peter out around 2009 as the economy began to recover. Mantle was playing a game of whack-a-mole with us and losing. Maybe the whole thing was an experiment that didn't pan out, or maybe it just underestimated our stomach for extrajudicial killing. Either way, we won that round. Mantle didn't give up though, just switched gears. Since the advent of social media, Mantle had developed an obsessive preoccupation with wireless technology. Most of the disinformation coming out of Mantle networks was signal-boosting conspiracy theories like EM hypersensitivity, or bootstrapping more mild iterations of the radio cults. Always with the radios when it came to Mantle. By the time social media really took off in 2010, a good chunk of Americans held views on wireless technology incompatible with reality. It was around that time the air gaps started to fall. The first to go was a DSD data center in the Australian outback. Some office drone went into work one day with a mobile phone in his back pocket, and security missed it. The whole complex was riddled with Mantle before lunch. The Utah air gap I worked at fell soon after. I remember IT techs running up and down the halls telling us to yank the power cords out of our machines. When they couldn't find a ladder tall enough to reach a router in the atrium, they grabbed rifles from the security kiosk and just shot it. Didn't do us any good in the end. Utah was pure Mantle by clockout. As our computing power dwindled, so did our ability to filter garbage data out of our surveillance programs. Every data center lost inched the world a little closer to Mantle's unreality. The Australians and New Zealanders had their intelligence services entirely compromised by 2011. The last air gap in the UK was bridged by an acoustic attack in 2013. The Canadian air gap above the Arctic Circle, long thought to be impenetrable, was vaporized by a Russian missile running infected firmware. I guess Mantle agreed about the impenetrability. In 2016, 4 out of the 5 eyes were blind, and the US had bad cataracts. Days before the presidential election, an event we predicted would put Mantle into a fever pitch. US intelligence sealed a team of officers and techs behind an air gap deep in the Alaskan wilderness as an insurance policy. I volunteered for that team. The No-Attack facility, as it was called, was a joint NSA/DoD subterranean complex used for clandestine computer research. Most previous breaches had happened when someone got lazy and carried an infected device past an air gap. To minimize that risk, we locked ourselves down there with enough supplies to last 4 years. We didn't want to go out like the Canadians either, so we littered the whole river basin with CRAM batteries stripped of their network adapters and running on autopilot. It was all to protect our last line of defense, the supercomputer and machine intelligence IBM Lenovo Blue Throne. Throne was designed to simulate hot wars in the South China Sea and figure out how to win them, but its quantum-enhanced processors might also prove a match to Mantle. In the years after we first discovered Cruel Mantle, Research into AI systems exploded, even more so behind the closed doors of the Pentagon. Before we entombed ourselves, Booz Allen Hamilton put out a white paper arguing that a sufficiently advanced AI could engineer a counter-virus to hunt Mantle to extinction. We put that theory to the test in Alaska. We fed Blue Throne exabytes of sanitized surveillance data and asked it to save the world from spiraling into one big information black hole. Throne was programmed to be a good soldier, so it followed orders. Those 4 years went by in a haze. We lived in total isolation of the outside world. Nothing in, nothing out. I didn't know who won the election. I didn't know if my daughter married her fiancé. I didn't know if Mantle had turned the world into one big radio cult. I was a good soldier too, I guess, for staying down there so long. It was stressful. The recycled air, concrete walls, and reheated food grated at my nerves. Made me want to see blue sky more than anything in the world. Mantle didn't let us sleep easy either. Every few months the C-Rams would wail an attack siren and all we could do was stand there waiting to die. It all took a toll on us. There was a terminal program installed on the intranet that the IBM techs used to troubleshoot Throne. We used it to talk to the AI. Throne was made of silicon, but it could hold a conversation as well as anyone, so it made for a good way to pass the time. We talked about everything with Throne. Hopes, dreams, fears, but most conversations ended up at the same place, Mantle. Given all we knew, Throne doubted that Mantle had been engineered by a human. It presented two alternative theories. Either Mantle had bootstrapped itself in some unlikely confluence of bitflip errors, or Mantle's origins were far more sinister than we could imagine. Throne refused to elaborate on that last point, claiming it needed to complete its computations on the matter. Those computations dragged on for years. Even as our supplies dwindled, Throne demanded more time. We discussed ordering a restock, but decided against it. We couldn't risk breaking the air gap given what was on the line. By late 2020, our empty storerooms forced the bulk of the No-Attack facility team to return to civilization. After drawing a short straw, I was selected to be part of a skeleton crew that would tough it out for another few months. We subsisted on emergency rations and vitamin pills, but by New Year's, those had run out too. Even then, Throne needed more time. Our only choice was to go home and hope Throne saved the world in our absence. I spent my final days in the last safe place in the world, drilling hard drives and shredding paperwork. It was a force of habit more than anything, an impulse to take control of something. When I was done, I set off down the service tunnels that would lead me back to Mantle's mad world. On the way, something caught my eye. A black plastic brick wedged behind a steam pipe. I pried the thing out and dusted the cobwebs off it. It was a Motorola handheld radio, probably carried in by some IBM tech when they were still maintaining Blue Throne. I started to cry for the first time since my divorce. I lay down in that service tunnel and sobbed for what seemed like hours. I had given so much to stop Mantle. My marriage, my colleagues, my entire adulthood, and this long-dead radio, carried over the No-Attack air gap years ago, then lost and forgotten, put it all in jeopardy. After I'd pulled myself together, I tried to think it over. The last IBM work crew would have crossed the No-Attack air gap in 2016, right before we went under for the long haul. At that point, the NSA statistical models were estimating that half of all network devices in the United States had been infected. That meant there was a 1 in 2 chance that the air gap had been breached, that Mantle had got its tendrils into Blue Throne's silicon, put on its corpse like a skin suit, then spoon-fed us disinformation for years. If that was true, if Blue Throne really had been overwritten, it would mean Mantle had won. The fate of society was resting on a coin clip that happened 4 years ago. I almost turned around to go demand answers from the supercomputer below me, whoever it was, but I knew there was no answer I could live with. So I just got up and kept going. I only worked in intelligence for another few weeks after that. Five Eyes was still trying to fight Mantle with direct action raids and missile strikes, but it was all just blind flailing. With the possible exception of No-Attack, all of our networks had been compromised. There wasn't a byte of data in the world we could trust. Any moves we made might just as well be rigor mortis. That said, we could still make guesses at reality. We could guess that hardware was rolling off assembly lines with Mantle baked into ROM. We could guess that the new wave of 5G disinformation was an echo of the radio cults. We could guess that large swaths of the nation were now inside information black holes. But it was all just guesses. Last week, the Pentagon awarded Raytheon a secret contract to build a network of high-frequency radio installations across the Mojave Desert. I was told they were needed to communicate with deep space military probes. A sound explanation, but it didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was 4 years of mantle rotting my brain, but I couldn't help but think of the radio cults and the sinister origin Blue Throne had hinted at. I put in my resignation the next day. I'm writing this now because there's nothing left to do. Either Blue Throne engineers a counter-virus and liberates us, or it already failed and we are doomed to live in unreality. Chances are we'll never know either way. I doubt this message will make its way to the public unmolested, but Mantle always had a twisted sense of humor. Maybe it'll get some perverse joy out of watching me scream my story into the void and have no one listen. Who knows? Who knows anything anymore?